Today's story is about the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. But before we start the story, let me know which part of the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now. June 16th, 1963. The sun had not yet fully risen over the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The air was warm, around 18 degrees Celsius, typical for a June morning in the Central Asian steppe. A light breeze moved across the flat landscape, carrying the familiar scent of rocket fuel mixed with the dry smell of desert grass. The sky held that particular quality of early morning light, a pale blue gradually brightening toward the east. Valentina Tereshkova stood at the base of the Vostok 6 rocket. The rocket towered 38 meters above her, identical in design to the one that had carried Yuri Gagarin 2 years earlier. It was painted white, with a pale green tint from the liquid oxygen venting continuously from its tanks. The metal surface was cool despite the warming morning air. She wore a bright white pressure suit, different from the orange suits the male cosmonauts had worn. The suit was made of similar rubberized fabric with a white helmet that would seal shut with the same metal ring mechanism. The suit weighed 20 kilograms. Inside it, she wore a light blue undersuit and cotton undergarments beneath that. Valentina was 26 years old. She was not a pilot. She was not an engineer. 2 years earlier, she had been working at a textile factory in Yaroslavl, operating heavy machinery that wove cotton into fabric. Her hands had been rough from factory work, her days measured in production quotas and shift schedules. But she had a hobby, one that would change her life completely. On weekends, she jumped from airplanes with a parachute strapped to her back. She had made 126 jumps as a member of her local aeroclub. The journey from factory worker to cosmonaut had been improbable and swift. In 1961, after Gagarin's flight, Nikita Khrushchev had decided the Soviet Union should send a woman into space before the Americans did. It would be another propaganda victory, proof of Soviet gender equality, evidence that communist society enabled women to achieve what capitalist society could not. A secret program was established to select and train female cosmonauts. In early 1962, recruitment began quietly. Women across the Soviet Union who were members of aeroclubs received discreet inquiries. The requirements were specific: under 30 years old, under 170 centimeters tall, under 70 kilograms in weight, and experienced in parachute jumping. No flying experience was necessary. The spacecraft would be automated, requiring operators rather than pilots. More than 400 women were considered. From these, 58 were interviewed. From the interviews, 23 were selected for medical examinations. The examinations were thorough and grueling, testing every aspect of physical and psychological fitness. The tests included time in pressure chambers, centrifuge rides simulating G-forces, extended periods in isolation chambers, and countless measurements of every bodily function. 5 women were finally selected in March 1962. Valentina Tereshkova was among them. The others were Tatiana Kuznetsova, Irina Solovyeva, Zhana Yorkina, and Valentina Ponomaryova. They were taken to Star City, the secret training facility outside Moscow where cosmonauts prepared for spaceflight. They would train alongside the male cosmonauts, though in a separate program designed specifically for the women's mission. The training was intense and often painful. The women endured sessions in the centrifuge, a machine that spun them in circles at high speed, pressing them into their seats with forces up to 8 times normal gravity. The experience was nauseating and exhausting. Blood would drain from their heads toward their feet, causing vision to narrow and consciousness to waver. Some of the women vomited, all of them persevered. They spent time in isolation chambers, small rooms where they would sit alone for days, simulating the psychological stress of spaceflight. They practiced eating food from tubes, drinking water from containers designed for weightlessness, performing basic tasks while wearing bulky pressure suits and gloves. They studied spacecraft systems, learning the location and function of every switch and dial. They learned orbital mechanics, radio procedures, emergency protocols. They also continued parachute training, making jump after jump from aircraft. This was considered the most critical skill, as Soviet cosmonauts ejected from their capsules before landing and descended separately under parachutes. The women jumped in all conditions, in wind and rain, practicing precision landings, learning to control their canopies in difficult situations. Valentina proved herself capable and determined. She was not the most technically skilled of the group. Valentina Ponomariova had more education and better test scores, but Valentina Tereshkova had something else. She had the right biography. Her father had died in World War II when she was 2 years old, killed fighting the Germans. She came from a working-class family. She had worked in a factory, experiencing the life of an ordinary Soviet citizen. Her background was ideologically perfect for Soviet propaganda. In November 1962, the women completed their basic training. They were officially designated as cosmonauts, junior lieutenants in the Soviet Air Force. But no mission was immediately scheduled. They continued training, waiting for a decision about when and how the first woman would fly. The decision came in early 1963. A dual mission was planned. 2 Vostok spacecraft would launch on consecutive days in June. Vostok 5 would carry Valery Bykovsky, an experienced male cosmonaut, on a long-duration flight of up to 8 days. Vostok 6 would carry the first woman on a 3-day mission. The 2 spacecraft would orbit at the same time, coming within a few kilometers of each other, demonstrating Soviet capability for future rendezvous operations. The question was which woman would fly. The final decision rested with the State Commission, a group of officials and engineers who oversaw the space program. Each of the 5 women was evaluated. In May 1963, Valentina Tereshkova was selected as the primary candidate. Irina Solovyova was designated as backup. Valentina Ponomariova, despite her technical qualifications, was considered too independent and outspoken. The space program wanted someone who would follow orders and represent the Soviet system appropriately. For Valentina, the selection meant both triumph and terror. She would become the first woman in space, achieving something no other woman had done. But she would also face dangers she could only partially comprehend. Spaceflight was still new and unpredictable. Only 7 humans had been to space: Gagarin, Titov, Glenn, Carpenter, Shira, Cooper, and Nikolaev. Each flight had encountered problems. Some had been serious. The risks were real. The final weeks before launch were filled with intensive preparation. Valentina underwent additional medical tests, ensuring she was in peak physical condition. She practiced in the Vostok 6 capsule simulator, going through every procedure hundreds of times until her responses became automatic. She was fitted for her pressure suit, which had been custom-made for her body. She met with officials and scientists, answering questions about her readiness, demonstrating her knowledge. On June 14th, 2 days before her scheduled launch, Vostok 5 launched successfully carrying Valery Bykovsky. His mission would overlap with hers, both spacecraft orbiting simultaneously. The plan was proceeding. Now it was Valentina's turn. June 16th arrived. Valentina woke at 5 a.m. in her quarters at the Cosmodrome. She'd slept reasonably well, about 6 hours, monitored throughout the night by medical sensors attached to her body. When the doctors checked her vital signs, they noted her heart rate was elevated, around 75 beats per minute, higher than normal but expected given the circumstances. Her blood pressure was slightly elevated as well, at 130/85. She was nervous, which was entirely normal. Breakfast was served at 5:30. She ate the same food she would eat in space: meat paste and vegetable puree squeezed from aluminum tubes, black bread and coffee. The tubes were awkward to use, requiring squeezing and careful control to avoid making a mess. In space, without gravity, spillage would be problematic. She practiced now, as she had practiced many times before. After breakfast came the final medical examination. The doctors checked everything one more time: heart rate, blood pressure, reflexes, lung function, temperature. They looked into her eyes and ears, tested her balance, asked about any discomfort or concerns. Everything was acceptable. She was cleared for flight. At 6:30, technicians helped her into her pressure suit. The suit was put on in stages, a complicated process requiring assistance. First came the undergarments, then the inner layer of the suit, then the outer shell. The technicians connected hoses for ventilation and radio communications. They sealed zippers and checked every connection twice. The suit was tight and restrictive, making movement difficult. The helmet was heavy on her head. By 7 o'clock she was fully suited. She walked carefully, accompanied by her backup, Irina Solovyova, also in a pressure suit. They walked to the bus that would transport them to the launch pad. The walk was short, perhaps 50 meters across concrete pathways. The boots were soft-soled, but the suit made each step deliberate and effortful. Other people walked nearby, technicians and officials, but Valentina focused on her own careful progress. The bus ride took about 10 minutes. Inside, Valentina and Irina sat on padded benches. Others rode with them, engineers in work clothes, officials in suits, their faces serious. Through the bus windows the steppe rolled past, mostly flat with distant low hills. The launch complex came into view, the white rocket standing vertical against the blue morning sky. When the bus stopped at the launch pad, Valentina stepped down carefully. She looked up at the rocket. Photographers captured the moment. In the images she is smiling, though the smile is somewhat forced, a professional expression rather than spontaneous joy. She raised one arm in a wave to the crowd of observers. Around her dozens of people stood watching, many with cameras. Valentina walked to the base of the rocket where an elevator waited. The elevator was a simple platform with railings, operated by an electric motor. It would carry her to the spacecraft at the top of the rocket. She stepped onto the platform along with several technicians. The elevator began to rise slowly, taking nearly 2 minutes to reach the top. At the spacecraft level, Valentina stepped onto a small metal platform. The platform was about 2 meters square, surrounded by railings. On one side was the entrance hatch to the Vostok 6 capsule. The hatch was small, only 60 centimeters in diameter. The capsule itself was spherical, 2.3 meters across, identical to the capsules the male cosmonauts had used. Technicians helped Valentina through the hatch. She had to bend and twist to fit through the opening, made more difficult by the bulky suit. Inside, the capsule was cramped and filled with equipment. There was one seat, moulded to support a human body during launch and landing. The seat was covered in light-coloured fabric. Around the seat, curved instrument panels contained switches, dials and gauges. Valentina lowered herself into the seat. Technicians leaned in through the hatch, connecting her suit to the capsule's systems. They attached an air hose for breathing, a communications cable for the radio, and straps for the safety harness. The harness had multiple straps crossing over her chest and lap. The technicians pulled each strap tight, testing the connections, making sure everything was secure. The interior of the capsule smelled of new materials, rubber and metal and electronics, mixed with a slight chemical smell from the equipment. The temperature was comfortable, maintained by the capsule's systems. A circular window was positioned in front of Valentina's face, though it was currently covered by the protective shroud that enclosed the capsule. At 8:15, the technicians finished their work. They asked Valentina to confirm she could reach the necessary controls. She demonstrated by moving her gloved hands to touch several switches. The technicians were satisfied. One by one, they climbed back out through the hatch. The last technician gave her shoulder a gentle pat before leaving. Then she was alone. The hatch was closed from outside. Valentina heard the sounds of bolts being tightened, a rhythmic metallic clanking that lasted about 30 seconds. Then silence, broken only by the soft hiss of air through the ventilation system. She was sealed inside the capsule, enclosed in a metal sphere at the top of a rocket filled with explosive fuel. For the next hour and 45 minutes, Valentina waited. She lay in the seat, looking at the instruments, listening to voices from ground control through her headphones. The voices were calm and methodical, running through checklists, confirming that all systems were functioning properly. Valentina responded to each call, acknowledging, confirming, providing readings from instruments when requested. Her call sign was Chaika, the Russian word for seagull. Ground control would address her as Chaika, and she would respond using that name. The choice of call sign was deliberate, suggesting freedom and flight, a bird soaring over the ocean. In reality, she was confined in a small metal sphere, unable to move more than a few centimeters in any direction. During the wait, Valentina could feel the rocket beneath her. It swayed slightly in the wind, a gentle rocking motion. The structure creaked and groaned as the sun warmed the metal skin while the super-cold propellants inside caused contraction. Liquid oxygen continued to boil off, venting through valves with a sound like escaping steam. The rocket was alive with these sounds, a symphony of mechanical noises. At 9:30, ground control informed Valentina that fueling was complete. The rocket now contained its full load of propellant, kerosene and liquid oxygen, 280,000 kilograms total. The liquid oxygen was maintained at minus 183 degrees Celsius. Despite insulation, some constantly boiled away and had to be replaced up until the moment of launch. Valentina's vital signs were being monitored continuously. Her heart rate had risen to 82 beats per minute. Her breathing rate was 15 breaths per minute. These numbers were higher than her normal resting rates, but lower than the doctors had expected. She was managing her stress well, maintaining composure despite the situation. At 10 o'clock, the final 30 minutes began. All systems were ready. The countdown would proceed unless some problem was discovered. Ground control asked Valentina if she was ready. She confirmed that she was. Her voice was steady, professional. She checked her harness one more time, tested that she could reach the abort handle if needed, verified that her radio was working clearly. The Vostok 6 spacecraft, like all Vostok spacecraft, was designed to operate automatically. Valentina was a passenger more than a pilot. The spacecraft systems would control orientation, engine firing, and re-entry according to pre-programmed sequences. Manual controls existed but were locked, accessible only with a special code. This design reflected Soviet concerns about how humans would function in space. The engineers worried that weightlessness or stress might impair judgment, so they automated everything possible. Valentina had been given the unlock code in a sealed envelope, just as the male cosmonauts had been. The envelope was secured inside the capsule. She could open it in an emergency if the automatic systems failed. But the assumption was that automation would work, and manual intervention would not be needed. At 10:20, the support arms began to pull away from the rocket. These were large metal structures that had surrounded the rocket, providing access for technicians. Now they retracted on rails, rolling back to a safe distance. Valentina felt the change in the rocket's movement. Without the support arms, the rocket now stood free, held only by the base clamps that would release at ignition. 10 minutes to launch. Ground control's voices continued their calm progression through the checklist. They confirmed readings from the rocket systems, from the engines, from the guidance computer, from the spacecraft. Everything was functioning as designed. The weather was good. Visibility was excellent. There were no technical issues requiring delay. 5 minutes to launch. Valentina took a deep breath, trying to relax. She had trained for this moment for over a year. She knew what would happen, what to expect. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The violence of launch, the G-forces, the vibration, the noise. These were realities she would soon face directly. 3 minutes to launch. The final checks were completed. The blockhouse where the controllers worked was sealed. Observers had withdrawn to safe positions. Cameras were recording, pointed at the rocket from multiple angles. This would be a historic moment, captured for posterity and propaganda. 2 minutes. Valentina heard new sounds through the rocket structure. Pumps starting, valves opening, pressure building in the fuel lines. The engines were being prepared for ignition. Everything was becoming active, mechanical systems coming alive in sequence. 1 minute. Ground control counted down the final seconds now. 30 seconds, 20, 15, 10. Each number was spoken clearly, marking the inexorable approach of ignition. At 5 seconds before launch, the engines ignited. Valentina heard and felt it simultaneously. A deep rumbling grew rapidly from a distant sound to an overwhelming roar that filled the capsule despite its insulation. The rocket began to shake violently. Her vision blurred from the vibrations. The instruments before her became difficult to read. This was exactly what the male cosmonauts had described, but experiencing it herself was different, more intense than she had imagined. The rocket remained on the pad for several seconds while the engines built to full thrust. 20 combustion chambers fired together, producing a combined thrust powerful enough to lift 280,000 kilograms of vehicle and propellant. The sound was tremendous, a continuous explosion audible for kilometers across the steppe. At exactly 10:29:51 Moscow time, the launch clamps released. The rocket began to rise. The movement was slow at first, barely perceptible, then accelerating. Valentina felt weight pressing down on her as the rocket climbed. The G-forces built quickly. Within seconds, she felt nearly 4 times her normal weight compressing her into the seat. The noise did not decrease. If anything, it grew louder as the rocket accelerated and air rushed past the capsule at increasing speeds. The vibrations continued, a constant shaking that made everything blur and jump. Valentina had trained for this in the centrifuge, but the centrifuge had been smooth compared to this. The launch was violent, chaotic, barely controlled. Through her headphones, she could hear ground control, their voices faint beneath the roar of the engines. She reported her status as trained. "Yachaika," she said. "I am Seagull." Her voice was strained by the G-forces pressing on her chest, making breathing difficult. But she spoke clearly enough for ground control to understand. The rocket climbed faster with each passing second. 20 seconds after liftoff, it was travelling at 100 meters per second. 40 seconds after liftoff, 300 meters per second. The acceleration was constant, relentless. Valentina's body pressed harder into the seat. Her arms felt impossibly heavy. Her head was forced back against the headrest. The G-forces reached 4.5 and held steady. At 119 seconds into the flight, the 4 strap-on boosters exhausted their fuel. They separated from the central core with a series of loud bangs that Valentina heard clearly despite the continuing roar. The boosters fell away, tumbling back toward Earth. The sudden release of their weight caused a brief moment of reduced G-force, a lightening that Valentina felt distinctly. Then the acceleration resumed as the central core's engine continued to fire. With the boosters gone, the rocket was lighter and faster. The G-forces increased again, climbing toward 5. Valentina focused on breathing, on maintaining consciousness. The pressure on her chest was immense. Each breath required effort. Her vision began to narrow at the edges, a greying caused by blood being forced away from her head. This was normal, expected, trained for. She continued to report her status, though her voice was now heavily strained. At 300 seconds into the flight, the central core exhausted its fuel. The main engine shut down. The sudden silence was startling. For 5 minutes, Valentina had been surrounded by overwhelming noise. Now, abruptly, it stopped. The capsule was briefly quiet except for the hiss of ventilation and the crackle of the radio. But the flight was not complete. The third stage engine now ignited. This smaller engine would push the spacecraft to orbital velocity. The acceleration resumed, pressing Valentina back into her seat again. The G-forces built to 6, the highest she would experience during the flight. The third stage burned for 241 seconds, just over 4 minutes. During this time, Valentina continued her reports to ground control. She described what she saw through the window, the sky growing darker, transitioning from blue to black. She described how she felt, the pressure on her body, the difficulty breathing, the weight of her limbs. Her voice remained professional despite the strain. At approximately 676 seconds after launch, 11 minutes and 16 seconds after leaving the pad, the third stage engine shut down. This time, the silence was permanent. No more engines would fire until time came to return to Earth. The Vostok 6 spacecraft separated from the spent third stage. Small springs pushed them gently apart. The stage tumbled away into the darkness of space. And then, weightlessness. The sensation arrived instantly and completely. Valentina felt herself lift against the harness. The weight that had pressed her into the seat for 11 minutes vanished utterly. Her arms floated up. Objects inside the capsule that had been secured began to drift if their attachments were loose. Valentina had experienced brief weightlessness during training flights in aircraft that flew parabolic arcs, providing 20 or 30 seconds of free fall. But this was different. This did not end after 20 seconds. The sensation continued, constant and strange. Her body no longer had weight. Nothing pressed against anything unless held in place by straps or restraints. The first few moments were disorienting. Her inner ear, which sensed balance and orientation on Earth, received no signals about which way was up or down. There was no up or down anymore. Her stomach felt odd, a floating sensation that was uncomfortable though not quite nausea. She swallowed several times. The feeling did not disappear, but it became more tolerable as seconds passed. Ground control asked if she was well. Valentina confirmed that she was. She described the sensation of weightlessness, speaking carefully and precisely. She moved her arms experimentally, testing how they behaved without gravity. The slightest motion caused them to float upward or sideways. She had to relearn movement, using gentle actions instead of the forceful motions that worked on Earth. The Vostok 6 spacecraft was now in orbit around Earth. The orbit was elliptical, not circular. At its lowest point, the spacecraft was 169 kilometers above Earth's surface. At its highest point, 231 kilometers. The spacecraft traveled at approximately 27,000 kilometers per hour. At this speed, it would complete one orbit every 88 minutes. Through the window, Valentina could see Earth below. The view was extraordinary, overwhelming. She saw clouds, brilliant white against deep blue ocean. She saw land, brown and green, with mountains appearing as textured relief. She saw coastlines, the sharp boundary where continents met seas. Everything was clear and detailed. The colours were more vivid than anything she'd seen from an aircraft. The spacecraft was rotating slowly as it orbited, about 1 revolution per minute. This rotation was intentional, helping to distribute the sun's heat evenly across the spacecraft's surface. The rotation meant that the view through the window changed continuously. First Earth filled the window, then it slid away and space appeared, black and empty and filled with stars. Then Earth returned from a different angle. Valentina released some of her harness straps. She did not remove the harness completely, but she loosened it enough to float slightly away from her seat. This gave her more freedom to move and look around. She tested eating and drinking in weightlessness. She had tubes of food attached to her suit. She squeezed a tube and pushed some paste into her mouth. The food was soft and easy to swallow, though the taste was bland. Drinking was more difficult. Water from a tube had to be sucked carefully to prevent droplets from floating away. The spacecraft's automatic systems adjusted its orientation. Small thruster jets fired briefly, rotating the spacecraft to the correct angle. Valentina heard each thruster firing, a soft pop followed by a brief hiss. The spacecraft would turn slightly each time. These adjustments were necessary to maintain proper orientation for communications and for the eventual firing of the retro rocket that would bring her home. Minutes became an hour. Valentina settled into the routine of spaceflight. She checked instruments, noting readings for temperature, pressure, oxygen level and power consumption. Everything appeared normal. The spacecraft was functioning as designed. She took photographs through the window using a camera mounted inside the capsule. She observed Earth's features, trying to identify continents and oceans, though many things were difficult to recognize from this height and angle. But something felt wrong. The sensation was subtle at first, a vague discomfort that Valentina tried to ignore. Her stomach felt increasingly unsettled. The floating sensation that had been merely odd was becoming unpleasant. She felt warm, perhaps too warm, and slightly dizzy. These were symptoms of space sickness, a condition that affected many cosmonauts and astronauts when they first entered weightlessness. Valentina did not report this to ground control. She had been instructed to report any problems, but she worried that admitting illness might result in the mission being cut short. She wanted to complete her 3 days in orbit. She wanted to prove that a woman could endure spaceflight as well as any man. So she said nothing about her growing discomfort, describing instead the beauty of Earth and the fascination of weightlessness. 2 hours into the flight, she passed over the Soviet Union for the second time. Ground stations tracked her progress, confirming her orbital path. Everything appeared normal from the ground. The spacecraft was in the correct orbit. All systems were functioning, communications were clear. The mission was proceeding as planned. But inside the capsule, Valentina was feeling progressively worse. The nausea was building. Her head ached. The confined space felt oppressive. She looked at the instruments and tried to focus on her tasks, but concentration was difficult. The 3 days ahead seemed suddenly very long. 4 hours into the flight, Valentina made a discovery that shocked her. She was testing the manual orientation controls, checking that they would work if needed. The controls allowed the spacecraft to be rotated manually using the thruster jets. She activated the controls experimentally, expecting the spacecraft to respond in a certain way. It did not respond correctly. When she pushed the control to rotate in one direction, the spacecraft rotated in the opposite direction. The control system had been installed incorrectly. The wiring was reversed. If she needed to orient the spacecraft manually, for instance to align it properly for the retrorocket burn that would bring her home, she would have to remember to push the controls opposite to the direction she wanted to go. This was a serious problem, potentially catastrophic. The automatic systems were supposed to handle orientation, but if they failed, manual control would be necessary. With the controls reversed, she might orient the spacecraft incorrectly. If the retro rocket fired while the spacecraft was pointed the wrong way, she would not return to Earth. She would be sent into a higher orbit or even into an escape trajectory, travelling away from Earth with no way to return. Valentina's heart rate increased as she realised the implications. She checked the controls again, carefully, making sure she understood the error. The reversal was consistent. Up was down, left was right, forward was backward. She would have to compensate mentally, translating every intended motion into its opposite. She considered reporting the problem to ground control, but she hesitated. The mission was already controversial. Some officials had opposed sending a woman into space, arguing that women were not reliable in emergencies. If she reported a problem on the first day, it might confirm those prejudices. They might abort the mission, bringing her down early, declaring the experiment a failure. Valentina made a decision. She would not report the control reversal immediately. She would note it, compensate for it if necessary, and mention it later if it became relevant. For now, she would continue the mission as planned, trusting the automatic systems to work properly. Hours passed. The Earth rotated below her. She crossed continents and oceans, seeing the planet from perspectives no woman had seen before. She passed over Africa, brown and vast with the Nile River visible as a thin line. She passed over the Atlantic Ocean, deep blue and featureless except for scattered clouds. She passed over South America, the Amazon rainforest appearing as a dark green expanse. The nausea persisted. It did not worsen dramatically, but it did not improve either. Valentina felt constantly on the edge of being sick. She ate sparingly, worried that food would trigger vomiting. She drank water from the supply tubes, staying hydrated, but the water sat uncomfortably in her stomach. She tried to rest, closing her eyes and breathing steadily, but true rest was impossible in this state. 6 hours into the flight, she had completed nearly 4 orbits around Earth. Valery Bukovsky, orbiting in Vostok 5, was on his 3rd day in space, having launched 2 days earlier. The 2 spacecraft came within 5 kilometers of each other at one point, and they spoke by radio, congratulating each other, exchanging brief descriptions of what they saw. But mostly Valentina was alone with her thoughts and her discomfort. Night fell on the ground stations below. The sun set rapidly from Valentina's perspective in orbit, sinking below Earth's curve in just a few minutes. The terminator, the line between day and night on Earth's surface, was sharp and beautiful, a gradient from bright daytime to complete darkness. Cities appeared as clusters of lights in the darkness. Lightning from thunderstorms flashed in clouds, visible from above as brief bright spots. Orbital sunset was followed by orbital sunrise just 45 minutes later. The sun appeared suddenly at Earth's horizon, brilliant white, too bright to look at directly. The light that filled the capsule was harsh and unfiltered, creating sharp shadows. Valentina shielded her eyes until the automatic sun filter on the window darkened, reducing the glare. 8 hours into the flight, Valentina tried to eat a more substantial meal. She had food tubes containing meat paste, vegetable puree, and fruit paste. She squeezed the meat paste into her mouth. The taste was bland and somewhat unpleasant. She chewed and swallowed, forcing herself to eat despite her nausea. Food was necessary to maintain her strength. She could not afford to become weak. But shortly after eating, the nausea intensified. Her stomach churned. She felt hot and clammy. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, trying to control the sensation. For several minutes she thought she might vomit. She held very still, willing the feeling to pass. Gradually, slowly, the intensity decreased to its previous level. The crisis passed. But the message was clear. Eating made her feel worse. 10 hours into the flight, as she completed her 7th orbit, Valentina began to feel the accumulated fatigue of the day. She had been awake since 5 a.m., 15 hours earlier. She had endured the stress of launch, the transition to weightlessness, the discovery of the control problem and ongoing nausea. Her body wanted rest. But sleep was difficult. The capsule was small and confining. Every sound was amplified. The ventilation system hummed constantly. The radio occasionally crackled with transmissions from ground control. Her body floated in the harness, held loosely but unable to lie down properly. Her mind was alert, processing the strangeness of her situation, worrying about the control reversal, monitoring her body's symptoms. She dozed fitfully, falling into light sleep for minutes at a time before waking. In the brief periods of sleep, she dreamed confused fragments of being back on Earth, of falling, of the factory where she had worked. Then she would wake, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. 12 hours into the flight. Valentina had now been in space for half a day. She had completed 8 orbits around Earth. She had travelled approximately 320,000 kilometres, though she had returned to roughly the same position relative to Earth's surface. She still had 60 hours remaining in the mission, 2.5 more days. The thought was daunting. She spoke with ground control during a communications window. They asked how she felt. She reported that she was well, that the spacecraft was functioning perfectly, that she was conducting her observations and completing her assigned tasks. She mentioned nothing about the nausea or the control reversal. Her voice was professional and steady, giving no indication of her discomfort. Ground control seemed pleased with her reports. They provided updates on her orbital parameters, confirmed that she was on track, and gave her instructions for the next phase of the mission. They told her to try to rest during the next few orbits, as this was a quiet period with no specific tasks scheduled. She acknowledged and prepared to attempt sleep again. But sleep remained elusive. Valentina closed her eyes and tried to relax, but her mind would not quiet. She thought about her family back on Earth, her mother, her brother, her sister. She thought about the other trainee cosmonauts, wondering if they were envious or relieved not to be in her position. She thought about the control problem, running through scenarios in her mind, imagining what she would do if the automatic systems failed. 14 hours into the flight. The cabin felt stuffy despite the ventilation. Valentina's pressure suit, which she had not yet removed, was uncomfortable and restrictive. She was supposed to take it off after the first day, transitioning to lighter clothing for the remainder of the mission. But the effort required to remove the suit seemed overwhelming. She decided to wait, to keep the suit on for now, to deal with it later when she felt more capable. Her head continued to ache, a dull, persistent pain behind her eyes. The ache was made worse by the pressure of the helmet, which she still wore. The helmet was heavy, and in weightlessness, it did not sit naturally on her head, but rather floated slightly, held in place by the suit's neck ring. The rim of the neck ring pressed against her shoulders, creating sore spots. She tried adjusting her position, floating in different orientations to relieve pressure points, but there was limited space to maneuver. The capsule was only 2.3 meters in diameter, and most of that volume was occupied by equipment. Her movement was constrained by the harness straps that kept her from floating freely and potentially hitting sensitive instruments. 16 hours into the flight. Earth continued to pass beneath her. She had seen sunrise and sunset multiple times now. The novelty of the view had not diminished. Earth was always beautiful, always fascinating, but the physical discomfort made it difficult to appreciate fully. She took photographs as required, operated the camera, documented her observations, but her enthusiasm was muted by how poorly she felt. She tried eating again, forcing down some fruit paste from a tube. The sweetness was cloying, but she needed calories. She drank water, careful to prevent droplets from escaping. Basic survival tasks, eating, drinking, monitoring systems, occupied much of her time. There was always something to check, something to record, something to do. 18 hours into the flight. Valentina had now been awake for about 28 hours with only brief periods of fitful dozing. Exhaustion was setting in. Her reactions were slower, her thinking less sharp. She noticed herself making small errors, misreading instruments, fumbling with equipment. These were warning signs of fatigue. Ground control recommended she try to sleep properly during the next few orbits. She would be passing over the Soviet Union several times, and they could monitor her vital signs while she slept. If any problems developed, they could wake her with a radio call. She agreed, knowing she needed rest, but doubting she could achieve real sleep in her current state. She closed her eyes again. She tried to ignore the nausea, the headache, the discomfort of the suit and helmet. She tried to clear her mind, to stop worrying about the control reversal and the long hours ahead. She focused on her breathing, slow and steady, in and out, a rhythm to carry her toward unconsciousness. Gradually, over perhaps 30 minutes, she felt herself beginning to drift. The sounds of the capsule faded slightly. Her awareness of her body's discomforts diminished. Sleep approached. Finally. Mercifully. She slept, though not deeply. It was the light sleep of someone in an unfamiliar place, alert to any change or noise. but it was sleep nonetheless, and her exhausted body accepted it gratefully. She floated in her harness, helmet resting against the headrest, arms drifting slightly, breathing steady. Earth turned below. The spacecraft traced its orbital path, rising and falling in its elliptical trajectory, crossing from daylight into darkness and back again every 90 minutes. Valentina slept through several orbits, her body finally getting the rest it desperately needed. When she woke, several hours had passed. She opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through the window. She had no immediate sense of how long she'd slept. She checked the mission clock, 24 hours into the flight. She had slept for about 5 hours. It was not enough, but it was something. She felt slightly better, though the nausea remained. The headache was still present, but less severe. The rest had helped, even if it had not been perfect. She moved carefully, testing her body's responses, trying to assess her condition. She was functional. She could continue. Ground control contacted her as she passed over Soviet territory. They asked for her status report. She provided it, describing her sleep, confirming that systems were normal, reporting her observations. Again, she mentioned nothing about feeling sick. The mission was 1 day complete. 2 more days remained. She attempted to eat breakfast, though calling it breakfast was arbitrary in orbit where dawn occurred every 90 minutes. She consumed some of the paste foods, drinking water to help them down. Her stomach accepted the food without immediate rebellion, which was an improvement. The second day in orbit continued. Valentina performed her assigned tasks. She took photographs of Earth's horizon for scientific purposes, helping researchers understand atmospheric phenomena. She tested how her body adapted to weightlessness, performing exercises that measured coordination and reaction time. She operated equipment, recorded data, maintained the spacecraft. She communicated with Valery Bykovsky again by radio. He was on his 4th day in orbit, having launched before her. He asked how she was feeling. She said she was well, that everything was going smoothly. They discussed what they could see from their respective positions. His spacecraft was in a slightly different orbital plane, so they saw different portions of Earth at different times. The conversation was brief and professional, both of them aware that their communications were being monitored and recorded. 30 hours into the flight. Valentina had completed more than 20 orbits around Earth. She had travelled well over 500,000 kilometres, though her position relative to Earth's surface traced the same repeating path. The spacecraft's orbit carried her as far north as 65 degrees latitude and as far south as 65 degrees latitude, covering most of the inhabited world. The nausea had become her constant companion. It never left completely, though its intensity varied. Sometimes it receded to a background discomfort that she could nearly ignore. Other times it surged forward, demanding all her attention, threatening to overwhelm her. She had learned to move very slowly and deliberately. Quick movements made the nausea worse. She had learned to avoid looking at the spinning Earth outside the window for too long. The motion visible through the window conflicted with her body's sense of stillness, creating vertigo. The food situation was becoming problematic. She needed to eat to maintain her strength, but eating made her feel worse. She had tried various foods from her supplies, hoping to find something more tolerable. The meat paste was the worst. The vegetable puree was slightly better. The fruit paste was the most tolerable, though its sweetness became cloying after a while. She ate small amounts frequently rather than larger meals, trying to keep something in her stomach without overloading it. She had finally removed her pressure suit after the first day. The process had been exhausting, requiring her to work in the confined space, disconnecting hoses and unfastening numerous closures. Underneath, she wore a light blue flight suit, much more comfortable than the bulky pressure suit. The relief of having the suit off was significant. She could move more freely, and the pressure points where the suit had rubbed were finally relieved. But her head still ached. The ache had become worse over time, not better. She suspected it was related to the cabin environment. Perhaps carbon dioxide levels were slightly higher than optimal, or the air pressure was not quite right, or she was simply not getting enough oxygen. Or it might be a symptom of space adaptation syndrome, her body's response to weightlessness. There was no way to know for certain. 36 hours into the flight. She was now well into her 2nd full day in orbit. She had passed the halfway point of her mission. In theory, this should have been encouraging. In practice, it meant only that she still had more than 30 hours remaining before she could go home. The hours stretched ahead of her, an endless succession of orbits, each one bringing her no closer to relief. She tried to rest again during a quiet period. She closed her eyes and floated in her harness, willing herself to sleep. But sleep was difficult. Her body was confused by the lack of normal day-night cycles. She had seen the sun rise and set dozens of times. Her circadian rhythms, evolved over millions of years to respond to Earth's 24-hour rotation, had no idea what to make of 90-minute day-night cycles. She dozed for perhaps an hour, falling into light sleep that provided some rest but left her still tired when she woke. When she opened her eyes, Earth was below her again, beautiful and terrible in its immensity. She could see the Mediterranean Sea, blue and familiar, surrounded by the coastlines of Europe and North Africa. She could see Greece and Italy, land masses she had studied in school, now visible as actual places, real geography rather than lines on a map. 40 hours into the flight, ground control asked her to perform some scheduled experiments. She was to test her coordination by performing specific movements and tasks, measuring how well she could function in weightlessness. She was to reach for targets, manipulate objects, write notes. The scientists wanted data on how a human body adapted to the space environment. Valentina performed the tests as required. She reached for targets marked inside the capsule, touching them in sequence. She manipulated small objects, moving them from one location to another. She wrote brief notes on a pad secured near her seat. Her performance was adequate but not excellent. Her movements were slower than they should have been, slightly clumsy. The nausea and fatigue affected her coordination. She did not mention this in her reports. She described the test as completed successfully. The ground controllers had no way to assess her performance directly. They relied on her verbal reports and on the limited telemetry data from the spacecraft. As long as she said everything was fine, they assumed everything was fine. 48 hours into the flight, 2 full days in orbit. Valentina had completed 32 orbits around Earth. She had seen more sunrises and sunsets in 2 days than most people saw in a month. She had crossed continents and oceans dozens of times. She had looked down at Earth from a height where the curvature was obvious, where the thin blue line of the atmosphere was visible, where the planet appeared as a sphere floating in the void. But she felt terrible. The nausea persisted. The headache throbbed behind her eyes. She was exhausted but could not sleep properly. Her body ached from being in the confined space, unable to stretch out fully, always pressed or held by straps and restraints. She wanted to go home more than she had ever wanted anything. She ate a small amount of food, forcing it down. She drank water, staying hydrated. She checked the spacecraft systems, confirming that everything was functioning. All the readings were normal. The spacecraft was performing perfectly. The problem was not with the machine. The problem was with her. She thought about the control reversal that she had discovered on the first day. She had not mentioned it to ground control. She still believed the automatic systems would work correctly, and manual control would not be necessary. But doubt nagged at her. What if the automatic systems failed? What if she needed to orient the spacecraft manually? Would she remember in a moment of stress that the controls were reversed? Would she push the wrong direction and send herself permanently into space? 54 hours into the flight, the 3rd day in orbit, the final day of her mission. Tomorrow morning, though morning was arbitrary in orbit, the retro-rocket would fire. The spacecraft would slow down, dropping out of orbit, beginning its descent back to Earth. She would experience the violence of re-entry, the heat and G-forces and uncertainty. But then she would be home. She would be on solid ground again. She would be able to lie down properly and sleep deeply and eat real food that stayed where it belonged. The prospect of returning gave her strength to continue. She performed her assigned tasks. She took more photographs. She made observations and recorded them. She spoke with ground control during communications windows, maintaining the fiction that everything was going well. Valery Bukovsky was also preparing to return. His mission would last longer than hers, ultimately 8 days, a new record for spaceflight duration. But he would begin his descent on the same day, landing a few hours after her. Both Vostok missions would conclude successfully, demonstrating Soviet capability in spaceflight. 60 hours into the flight, 3 hours remained until the scheduled retrorocket burn. Valentina began preparing for re-entry. She put her pressure suit back on, a laborious process that took nearly an hour. The suit would protect her during the violent descent and landing. She connected the suit to the spacecraft systems once again, checking that airflow and communications were working properly. She secured all loose items inside the capsule. In weightlessness, objects floated freely, but during re-entry, G-forces would return. Anything not secured would fall and potentially cause damage or injury. She checked that the equipment was properly stowed, that the camera was secured, that her food containers were fastened. She positioned herself in the seat, fastening the harness straps tightly across her chest and lap. She would need these straps during re-entry, when the deceleration forces pressed her forward against the restraints. She tested that she could still reach the important controls, though she hoped the automatic systems would handle everything. Ground control went through the re-entry checklist with her. They verified that she was ready, that the spacecraft was ready, that the orbital position was correct for the retrorocket burn. The burn would occur when the spacecraft was over Africa, travelling northwest toward the Soviet Union. The timing had to be precise. Fire too early, and she would land short of the target. Fire too late, and she would overshoot. 70 minutes until retro-rocket burn. Valentina waited, watching the clock, feeling her heart rate increase with anticipation and anxiety. This was the most dangerous part of the mission. Launch was violent but brief. Orbit was uncomfortable but relatively safe. Re-entry was violent and long and filled with opportunities for fatal failure. The spacecraft had a heat shield made of ablative material that would slowly burn away during re-entry, carrying heat away from the capsule. But the heat shield had to work perfectly. If it failed, if it cracked or separated or did not cover the capsule completely, the heat of re-entry, thousands of degrees, would penetrate the capsule. She would be incinerated before reaching the ground. 60 minutes until retro-rocket burn. Ground control provided updates on her trajectory. Everything was on track. The spacecraft's position was correct. The automatic systems were armed and ready. In 1 hour, the retrorocket would fire, slowing the spacecraft by about 150 meters per second, just enough to lower the orbital path until it intersected Earth's atmosphere. Valentina took deep breaths, trying to calm herself. The nausea made anxiety worse. Her stomach churned with both motion sickness and fear. She focused on the procedures she had memorized, the sequence of events that would unfold. Retro-rocket burn, separation of spacecraft modules, entry into atmosphere, peak heating, parachute deployment, ejection from capsule, personal parachute opening, landing. Each step had to succeed for her to survive. 50 minutes until retro-rocket burn. The spacecraft coasted in orbit, moving at 27,000 kilometers per hour relative to the ground below. At this speed, even a small change in velocity would have large effects on the trajectory. The retro-rocket would slow the spacecraft by less than 1% of its velocity, but that small change would be sufficient to bring it down. Valentina looked out the window at Earth passing beneath her. She could see the east coast of Africa, the Red Sea, the Arabian Peninsula. Soon she would be descending toward these landscapes, falling through the atmosphere, heading for the steppes of Kazakhstan where recovery teams waited. 40 minutes until retro-rocket burn. The automatic timer was counting down inside the spacecraft's computer. The computer would fire the retro-rocket at exactly the right moment, based on calculations performed by Soviet engineers and verified by ground control. Valentina had no role in this decision. She was a passenger waiting for the machine to act. But she thought again about the control reversal. If the automatic systems failed to orient the spacecraft correctly, she would need to use manual control. She ran through the procedure in her mind. Check orientation. If incorrect, use manual controls. But remember, push opposite to the intended direction. Up is down, left is right, forward is backward. She repeated this to herself, trying to embed it firmly in her memory. 30 minutes until retro-rocket burn. Ground control made final checks. They confirmed that the retro-rocket was armed. They confirmed that the spacecraft was in the correct position. They told Valentina to prepare for the burn. She acknowledged, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. 20 minutes until retro-rocket burn. Valentina checked her harness one more time. She verified that her helmet was properly sealed. She confirmed that she could breathe normally through the suit's air supply. Everything was as ready as it could be. 10 minutes until retro-rocket burn. The spacecraft continued its orbit, passing over North Africa, approaching the Mediterranean. In 10 minutes, the retro-rocket would fire. In 20 minutes, she would begin to feel the effects of atmospheric entry. In 40 minutes, if all went well, she would be on the ground. 5 minutes until retrorocket burn. Valentina's heart rate was now above 100 beats per minute. Medical monitors transmitted this data to ground control. The controllers noted the elevation but were not concerned. Elevated heart rate was normal and expected before re-entry. 3 minutes until retrorocket burn. Valentina closed her eyes briefly, offering a silent wish to any power that might be listening. She was not particularly religious, but at moments like this, such gestures felt appropriate. She opened her eyes and focused on the instruments. 1 minute until retrorocket burn. Ground control confirmed that the automatic sequence was proceeding. The timer was counting down the final seconds. Valentina braced herself. Though she knew the retrorocket burn would be gentle compared to the forces she would experience later during re-entry. The retrorocket fired at exactly the calculated moment. Valentina felt the push forward against her harness as the rocket, mounted behind the spherical capsule, fired its engine. The force was gentle, less than 1 G, barely noticeable after the violence of launch, but the effect was significant. The spacecraft began to slow down, losing velocity, dropping toward a lower orbit that would intersect the atmosphere. The burn lasted 40 seconds. When it ended, the spacecraft was traveling 150 meters per second slower than before. This change was enough. The new trajectory would bring the spacecraft down. There was no longer any choice, no way to abort or change course. Valentina was committed to re-entry now, for better or worse. The spacecraft and the spent retrorocket module should have separated at this point. Explosive bolts were supposed to fire, severing the connection, allowing the two modules to drift apart. The spherical re-entry capsule would continue alone, while the equipment module would burn up in the atmosphere. But the separation did not occur properly. The explosive bolts fired, but the modules remained connected by electrical cables that had not separated as designed. The equipment module dangled behind the re-entry capsule, held by these cables, creating an unstable configuration. Valentina felt the spacecraft beginning to rotate in an uncontrolled manner. The view through the window spun, Earth and space and sun wheeling past. This was wrong. This should not be happening. The spacecraft should be stable, oriented with the heat shield facing forward into the atmosphere. Instead, it was tumbling. She reported the problem to ground control, but she was already out of range of Soviet tracking stations. Her radio calls went unanswered. She was alone with the problem, just as Gagarin had been when he experienced a similar malfunction 2 years earlier. Valentina felt the first effects of atmospheric entry, a slight drag, a gentle deceleration, the very beginning of what would become intense forces. The spacecraft was now at an altitude where the atmosphere, though still incredibly thin, was thick enough to create friction. That friction would increase rapidly as she descended. The tumbling continued. The spacecraft rotated end over end, the rate of rotation increasing. Valentina experienced chaotic G-forces, pressing her first into her seat, then sideways, then upward against her harness. The forces grew stronger as the spacecraft descended deeper into the atmosphere. Her vision began to narrow and blur from the rotating G-forces. She knew she had to do something. The automatic systems were not correcting the problem. The spacecraft needed to be oriented properly, heat shield forward, or the heat of re-entry might penetrate the unprotected sides of the capsule. She made a decision. She would use the manual controls to try to stabilize the spacecraft. She opened the sealed envelope that contained the code to unlock the manual controls. Her hand shook slightly as she entered the code. The controls activated. Now she could attempt to fire the thruster jets manually to stop the rotation and establish proper orientation. But she had to remember, the controls were reversed. She needed to think backward, to translate every intended action into its opposite. The spacecraft was rotating. She wanted it to stop rotating. She needed to fire thrusters in the opposite direction to the rotation. But because the controls were reversed, she needed to push the control in the same direction as the rotation. It was confusing and counterintuitive. Her mind struggled to process the inverted logic while also dealing with the disorientation of tumbling and increasing G-forces. She made her first attempt, firing thrusters. The spacecraft's rotation changed but did not stop. She tried again, adjusting her inputs, compensating for the reversal. Gradually, through trial and correction, she managed to slow the rotation. The tumbling decreased. The spacecraft began to stabilize. She worked the controls carefully, firing short bursts from the thrusters, nudging the spacecraft toward the correct orientation. It took perhaps 5 minutes of intense concentration, 5 minutes during which she descended deeper into the atmosphere, 5 minutes during which the heat and forces built steadily. Finally, the spacecraft achieved approximately the correct orientation. The heat shield was facing roughly forward. The rotation had nearly stopped. Valentina released the manual controls, exhausted by the mental effort. She hoped the automatic systems would maintain orientation from here. At an altitude of approximately 100 kilometers, the spacecraft entered the denser layers of the atmosphere. The air, though still incredibly thin by ground-level standards, was thick enough to create significant friction and heat. The exterior of the capsule began to glow, first red, then orange, then white-hot. The G-forces increased dramatically as atmospheric drag decelerated the spacecraft. Valentina was pressed deep into her seat by forces that built rapidly to 4G, then 5G, then 6G. The pressure on her chest was immense. Breathing was difficult. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges going grey and then dark. She fought to remain conscious, knowing she might need to react if more problems developed. At approximately 90 kilometers altitude, the electrical cables connecting the re-entry capsule to the equipment module finally burned through. The cables, stressed by the tumbling and heated by the increasingly thick atmosphere, charred and severed. The equipment module separated, tumbling away to burn up completely in the atmosphere. The re-entry capsule was finally free. The capsule's aerodynamic design immediately took effect. The shape naturally caused the capsule to orient itself correctly, with the heat shield forward. The tumbling stopped. The chaotic forces ended. Valentina now felt a steady pressure pressing her into her seat as the capsule decelerated in the atmosphere. But the force was tremendous. The G-forces peaked at approximately 8, possibly higher. For several minutes, Valentina endured this crushing pressure. Her vision went almost completely grey. She could barely breathe. Her consciousness wavered. She focused on simply surviving, on not blacking out, on making it through this ordeal. The heat outside the capsule was incredible, over 3,000 degrees Celsius. The heat shield ablated as designed, burning away in a controlled manner, carrying heat away from the interior, but heat still penetrated. The temperature inside the capsule rose significantly. Valentina felt the heat through her suit. The air temperature increased to uncomfortable levels. Through the window, she could see flames. The capsule was surrounded by superheated plasma, glowing orange and yellow. The flames obscured any view of the outside world. She was falling through fire, protected only by layers of ablative material that were slowly sacrificing themselves to keep her alive. The radio went silent. The plasma surrounding the capsule blocked radio signals. Ground control could not hear her, and she could not hear them. She was completely isolated, alone in her falling sphere of fire, waiting for the ordeal to end. The G-forces peaked and then slowly began to decrease as the capsule's velocity dropped. The atmosphere was slowing her down, reducing her speed from orbital velocity to something more manageable. The flames outside gradually diminished as she descended into cooler, denser air. The orange glow faded. She began to see hints of blue sky beyond the fire. At an altitude of 7 kilometers, traveling at approximately 220 meters per second, the main parachute deployment sequence began. Valentina heard the sound of the deployment mechanism firing, a bang followed by a fluttering noise as the drogue parachute streamed out, stabilizing the descending capsule. Seconds later, the main parachute deployed. The large orange and white canopy filled with air above the capsule. The sudden deceleration was violent, jerking Valentina forward against her harness. But it was a welcome violence, because it meant the parachute had worked. She was no longer falling at terminal velocity. She was descending at a survivable rate. The capsule now fell at approximately 6 meters per second, slowly enough that the landscape below became visible in detail. Valentina looked out the window and saw steps, similar to those near the launch site but hundreds of kilometers away. She saw fields and scattered buildings. The landing zone was supposed to be near Karaganda in Kazakhstan, but she had no way to know if she was on target. At an altitude of 4 kilometers, the capsule hatch was supposed to blow off, preparing for the cosmonauts' ejection, but the hatch did not blow off on schedule. Valentina waited, expecting the explosive bolts to fire. Nothing happened. The hatch remained in place. This was a problem. If the hatch did not separate, she could not eject from the capsule. She would have to land with the capsule, riding it all the way to the ground. The capsule's landing would be hard, much too hard for a human to survive without serious injury. The ejection system existed precisely because landing in the capsule was dangerous. Valentina pulled the manual hatch jettison handle. The explosive bolts fired belatedly. The hatch blew off with a loud bang, tumbling away. Cold air rushed into the capsule, a welcome relief after the stifling heat of reentry. The temperature had been perhaps 40 degrees Celsius inside. The outside air was cool, probably around 15 degrees, and it felt wonderful. At an altitude of 2.5 kilometers, Valentina pulled the ejection seat handle. The seat fired, a powerful rocket blast that propelled her upward and outward through the open hatch. The acceleration was brief but intense. For a moment she travelled faster than the falling capsule, shooting upward. Then she cleared the hatch and her trajectory became ballistic. She and the ejection seat separated, pushed apart by small charges. Valentina's personal parachute deployed automatically. The orange and white canopy opened above her with a snap of fabric and a jerk of the harness. Her descent rate slowed to about 5 meters per second. She hung suspended beneath the parachute, finally separated from the spacecraft that had been her home for 3 days. She looked around, orienting herself. She could see the capsule descending nearby under its own parachute, falling slightly faster than she was. The ground was perhaps 2,000 meters below, rising to meet her. She could see details now, individual trees, buildings, roads, vehicles. She appeared to be descending toward farmland. But the wind was strong. Valentina felt herself being carried sideways, drifting away from the intended landing zone. The parachute descent took approximately 8 minutes from ejection to landing. During those 8 minutes, the wind pushed her several kilometers from where she should have landed. She saw the ground approaching. She prepared for landing as trained, keeping her legs slightly bent, ready to roll to absorb the impact. But she was exhausted, weakened by 3 days of nausea and poor sleep, and her reactions were slower than they should have been. She hit the ground hard, landing on her side. The impact was painful, knocking the wind from her lungs. Her helmet struck the ground and she felt a sharp pain in her face, where the helmet rim hit her nose. The parachute dragged her briefly before collapsing. She lay on the ground, stunned, trying to catch her breath. After a moment, she unclipped her parachute harness and sat up. Her nose was bleeding, not severely, but noticeably. She had bruises forming where she had hit the ground, but nothing felt broken. She was alive. She was back on Earth. The mission was over. She looked around at where she had landed. She was in an open area, scrubland with scattered bushes and grass. No people were immediately visible. The capsule had landed somewhere nearby, perhaps a kilometer or two away. She could not see it from her position. Valentina stood up carefully, testing her legs. They were shaky but functional. Gravity felt strange and heavy after 3 days of weightlessness. She was used to floating. Now every part of her body had weight again, pressing down, requiring effort to move. She felt heavier than she remembered, though she knew this was partly exhaustion and partly readjustment. She began walking, looking for people or buildings. After about 5 minutes, she heard voices. She walked toward them and encountered a group of local people, farmers and villagers who had seen her parachute descending. They approached cautiously, uncertain what to make of a woman in a spacesuit appearing in their fields. Valentina removed her helmet so they could see her face. "I am a Soviet cosmonaut," she said. "I have returned from space. I need to contact the authorities." The people's expressions changed from confusion to amazement. They gathered around her, asking questions, offering help. One man ran to get a vehicle. A woman brought water, which Valentina accepted gratefully. The water was cool and fresh, tasting infinitely better than the water from tubes she had been drinking for 3 days. Within half an hour, military personnel arrived. They had been tracking her descent and had mobilized recovery teams. The teams had been heading for the expected landing site, but had to adjust when they realized she had landed off target, carried by the wind. They found her with the help of a local people who had seen the parachutes. The soldiers treated Valentina with respect and care. They helped her remove her spacesuit, which was heavy and uncomfortable now that she was back in gravity. Underneath, she wore her light blue flight suit stained with sweat and bearing evidence of 3 hard days in space. Medical personnel examined her quickly, checking for obvious injuries. Apart from the bloody nose and some bruises, she appeared intact. A helicopter arrived to transport her. She was helped aboard and given a seat. As the helicopter lifted off, Valentina looked down at the landscape where she had landed. It looked different from Earth, as she had seen it from orbit. Less beautiful, more mundane, but infinitely more welcoming. This was solid ground, stable and unmoving where she belonged. The helicopter flew to a local military base. There, more doctors examined her thoroughly. They measured her vital signs, tested her reflexes, asked detailed questions about her condition. Her heart rate was elevated but steady. Her blood pressure was higher than normal. She was dehydrated and exhausted. But she was alive and reasonably healthy given what she had endured. She was allowed to call Baikonur to report her status directly. She spoke with the mission controllers, confirming that she had landed safely, describing briefly what had happened. She mentioned the tumbling during re-entry and the problem with the hatch. She did not yet mention the control reversal or the full extent of her space sickness. Those details could wait for the debriefing. That evening she was flown to a facility near Moscow. The flight took several hours. During the flight, Valentina tried to rest, but her mind was too active. She kept replaying the mission, thinking about what had happened, what had gone wrong, what she could have done differently. The 3 days in space seemed both endless and impossibly brief, a compressed eternity. At the facility near Moscow, she was reunited with officials and scientists from the space program. They congratulated her on the successful mission. She had become the first woman in space. She had orbited Earth 48 times, more than all the American astronauts combined at that point. She had spent nearly 71 hours in space, longer than any woman would spend in space for another 19 years. But the celebration felt hollow to Valentina. She had suffered terribly during the flight. She had been sick for most of the mission. She had dealt with serious technical problems that could have been fatal. She had hidden her difficulties from ground control, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. Now that fiction would continue, because admitting the truth might undermine the propaganda value of her achievement. In the days following her return, Valentina underwent extensive debriefings. She described every aspect of the mission in detail to engineers and doctors. She told them about the control reversal, shocking them with the revelation. She described her space sickness, which had been worse and longer lasting than expected. She explained how she had manually stabilized the spacecraft during the tumbling re-entry. The engineers were alarmed by the control reversal. An investigation revealed that the wiring had been installed incorrectly during manufacturing. It was a serious error that could have been catastrophic if Valentina had needed to use manual control without realizing the problem. The fact that she had discovered it and compensated for it demonstrated quick thinking and skill. The space sickness was also a concern. The doctors realized that women might respond differently to weightlessness than men, possibly due to hormonal differences or other physiological factors. More research would be needed. But this research would not happen for years because the Soviet Union did not send another woman into space until 1982, 19 years later. In public, the mission was presented as a complete success. Valentina was celebrated as a hero, proof of Soviet gender equality and technological superiority. She appeared at ceremonies and gave speeches. She met with Khrushchev and other leaders. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and given numerous other honors and medals. She was also pressured to marry Andrian Nikolaev, a male cosmonaut who had flown the previous year. The marriage was encouraged by authorities who wanted to create a space family for propaganda purposes. Valentina and Andrian married in November 1963, just 5 months after her flight. Khrushchev himself attended the wedding. The couple had a daughter the following year, the first child born to parents who had both been in space. But privately, Valentina struggled with the aftermath of her flight. She suffered from lingering effects of space sickness. She had nightmares about the tumbling re-entry, about being trapped in the capsule, unable to breathe, burning up. She felt guilt about hiding her difficulties during the mission, wondering if she should have been more honest. She also felt frustration that no other Soviet women would fly to space for nearly 2 decades. The female cosmonaut program was quietly discontinued. The remaining women who had trained alongside Valentina were released from service. The Soviet leadership had achieved their propaganda goal, sending a woman to space before the Americans, and saw no need to continue. Valentina remained in the space program in various roles. She trained other cosmonauts, sharing her experience. She represented the Soviet Union at international events. She became a spokesperson for the space program and for Soviet achievements, but she never flew again. Her 3 days in orbit remained her only spaceflight. Over the following decades, Valentina became an elder stateswoman of spaceflight. She witnessed the continued development of the Soviet space program, space stations, long-duration missions, spacewalks, the race to the moon. She saw women from other countries fly to space. Svetlana Savitskaya in 1982, Sally Ride in 1983, and many others afterward. She always maintained that her mission had been successful, that she had performed well, that she had proven women could function as effectively as men in space. But those close to her knew the reality had been more difficult. She had endured terrible discomfort, had solved critical problems that could have killed her, and had completed her mission through sheer determination. The full story of her difficulties was not revealed for many years. Soviet secrecy kept many details classified. Only in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did the complete truth about the control reversal, the extent of her space sickness, and the problems during re-entry become public knowledge. By then, Valentina was in her 60s, and spaceflight had become almost routine. Hundreds of people had flown to space. Women flew regularly with no special attention or controversy. The barriers that had seemed so significant in 1963 had been broken down. Valentina's contribution to breaking those barriers was recognized, though the full measure of her courage and suffering was only belatedly understood. In her later years, Valentina continued to advocate for space exploration and for women's participation in it. She attended anniversary celebrations of her flight. She met with young women interested in becoming astronauts or cosmonauts, encouraging them, sharing advice, connecting them with history. She lived long enough to see the 50th anniversary of her flight in 2013, when she was 76 years old. Celebrations were held in Russia and around the world. She gave interviews, recounting her experiences, reflecting on how spaceflight had changed. She expressed hope that humanity would continue to explore space, that people would eventually live permanently beyond Earth, that the journey she had begun would continue. On June 16, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova had climbed into Vostok 6 as a young woman of 26, a former factory worker with a passion for parachute jumping, chosen for her ideologically acceptable background and her determination. She spent 3 days in orbit, suffering through space sickness and technical problems, enduring isolation and fear, proving that a woman could survive spaceflight. She returned to Earth changed by the experience, having seen the planet from a perspective few humans had known. She had seen Earth as a sphere in space, beautiful and fragile, without borders or divisions visible from orbit. She had experienced weightlessness, the strange freedom of floating without up or down. She had felt the terror of re-entry, falling through fire, trusting her life to technology and mathematics. Her mission lasted 70 hours, 50 minutes. She completed 48 orbits of Earth. She travelled approximately 1.97 million kilometres. She endured forces up to 8G. She became the first woman in space, an achievement that would stand alone for 19 years until another Soviet woman flew. But more than the statistics, more than the records, Valentina's flight demonstrated human endurance and adaptability. She had faced unexpected problems and solved them. She had suffered physical discomfort and continued her mission. She had maintained composure under conditions that would have broken many people. She had succeeded when success was far from certain. The scientific data from her mission contributed to understanding how humans adapted to spaceflight. The knowledge that women experience space sickness differently than men led to changes in how crews were prepared and supported. The discovery of the control reversal led to improved quality control in spacecraft manufacturing. The problems with the hatch separation led to design improvements in later vehicles. Beyond the technical contributions, Valentina's flight had social and cultural impact. She became a symbol of women's capability, proof that women could perform in extreme environments traditionally dominated by men. Though her flight was partly propaganda, its reality transcended politics. A woman had gone to space. Other women would follow, building on her achievement, expanding on her legacy. The morning after her landing, Valentina woke in a bed in Moscow, back on solid ground for the first time in 3 days. She felt the bed beneath her, still and unmoving. She felt gravity pulling her down into the mattress. She stood and walked to a window looking out at the city. The ground stayed where it belonged. The horizon did not curve. The sky was pale blue, not the deep black of space. She touched the window glass, feeling its coolness and solidity. She was home. She had left Earth, orbited it nearly 50 times and returned. She had seen things no woman had seen before. She had proven something that needed proving, though the proof had cost her more than anyone knew. Years later, when asked about her flight, Valentina would say it was the defining experience of her life. Nothing else compared to those 3 days in orbit, alone in a metal sphere circling Earth, struggling with sickness and fear, emerging triumphant. She said she would do it again if given the chance, despite the suffering, because the experience was worth any price. She never flew again. But in those 3 days in June 1963, Valentina Tereshkova had done enough. She had opened a door that would never close. She had shown that space was not exclusively a male domain. She had demonstrated courage and skill and determination. She had earned her place in history not just as the first woman in space, but as one of the great pioneers of the space age. The sun that rose over Baikonur on the morning of her launch set over Moscow on the evening of her return. Between that sunrise and sunset, stretched across 3 days, Valentina had lived a lifetime of experience. She had left Earth as a factory worker and parachutist. She returned as a cosmonaut, a hero of the Soviet Union, and an inspiration to millions. The journey had changed her, as it changed everyone who left Earth and returned. She carried space with her for the rest of her life, in her memories and in her bones, a reminder of 3 days when she floated free.